In the year 60 of the Common Era, in the city of Alexandria, a Greek engineer named Hero set a small wheeled cart on a smooth floor, wound a series of ropes around two separate axles, attached a hanging weight to provide driving force, and released it. The cart rolled forward, turned left, turned right, completed a figure-8 pattern, and stopped, exactly where it was supposed to stop, following a course that had been encoded into it before it ever moved. Nobody touched it. Nobody steered it. Nobody guided it in real time. The path was already inside the machine before the machine started moving, stored in the geometry of the wound rope, expressed step by step as the weight descended, and the rope unwound in the sequence that had been deliberately arranged. This is, by the most technically precise definition available, a programmable machine, a device that follows preset instructions to complete a task autonomously, and it was built and described in a surviving written document nearly 2,000 years ago. If this kind of deep, properly sourced history of how ancient human ingenuity keeps reaching across the centuries to anticipate things we think of as modern is what you want to see more of, subscribe right now because we have 6 of these to get through and every one of them is real. Before we go through the 6, one honest framing point worth making at the start. The word robot carries modern connotations of artificial intelligence, independent decision-making, and machine awareness that none of these ancient devices possessed. What the ancient world built with remarkable consistency and across multiple civilizations that had no contact with each other was automata, from the Greek word meaning acting of one's own will, devices engineered to perform a sequence of preset actions without continuous human input. Some used steam, some gravity, some compressed air, some hydraulics, some moved, some made sounds, some did both. None were intelligent. All of them were genuinely remarkable. The word robot was first coined in a 1921 Czech play and didn't describe anything real for another century, so applying it to ancient devices is partly a matter of emphasis, but the engineering underlying these machines is genuinely continuous with the ideas that eventually produced modern robotics, and understanding that continuity is a genuinely interesting piece of intellectual history that most popular coverage of ancient technology simply skips over. Our first case is Archytas of Tarentum, a Greek mathematician, philosopher, and politician who flourished around 400 to 350 years before the Common Era in what is now southern Italy. Archytas is a significant figure in the history of mathematics and mechanics, credited with founding the study of mathematical mechanics as a formal discipline, and he was close enough to Plato that several ancient sources describe a friendship between them. He was also, according to multiple ancient written sources preserved across the following centuries, the creator of what may be the earliest self-propelled flying device in recorded history. Ancient authors, including Aulus Gellius, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, describe a wooden bird, sometimes called a dove and sometimes described as resembling a pigeon, that Archytas built and demonstrated. The device was suspended from a pivoted bar and propelled either by steam or compressed air, with the most detailed descriptions suggesting it could travel distances of around 60 meters along the bar before the power ran out, with some accounts giving significantly larger figures. The bird's body was hollow and cylindrical, with wooden wings attached on each side. The rear connected to an internal bladder which connected to a heated boiler, and when steam pressure built sufficiently, the device was launched from its starting position. It is genuinely important to be precise about what the evidence for this actually is. No physical prototype has survived, and no engineering schematic exists. What exists are textual descriptions written centuries after Archytas' death, based on accounts that were themselves already being passed down by that point. The exact mechanism is genuinely uncertain, and historians and engineers have proposed several different plausible reconstructions. One competing reading of the ancient sources suggests the bird wasn't free-flying at all, but rather hopped from a lower to a higher perch using a counterweight and pulley arrangement triggered by compressed air, which would be impressive in its own right, if considerably less dramatic than the steam-powered flight some sources imply. What's not genuinely in doubt is that Archytas existed, was a real and important mathematician and engineer whose influence on mechanics was acknowledged in antiquity, and was described by contemporaries and near-contemporaries as having built some kind of mechanical bird that moved through the air on its own, making this one of the earliest recorded instances of anyone building a self-propelled device of any kind. The second case is considerably better documented, both because more detailed description survived and because the machine in question was designed not as a demonstration, but as a functional tool. This is Hero of Alexandria, the same engineer whose programmable cart we opened with, working in Alexandria probably in the 1st century of the Common Era. Hero was prolific. He wrote books on geometry, mechanics, surveying, optics, and engineering, several of which have survived in various degrees of completeness, and his body of work describes dozens of devices, some practical and some explicitly intended as theatrical spectacles. The two that most directly bear on the history of automata are his programmable cart and his automated theatrical performances. The cart is described in enough technical detail that modern engineers have built working replicas based on Hero's own written instructions, and those replicas confirm that the described mechanism genuinely works. A falling weight connected via ropes wound around two separate axles provided the driving force, and the key innovation was that the ropes could be wound in specific patterns and with knots placed at specific points, so that as the weight descended and the rope played out, the wheels would turn in preset sequences, causing the cart to turn left, turn right, or continue straight in a pattern determined entirely by how the rope had been wound before the machine started. Different patterns of winding produced different paths. This is in principle nearly identical to how a punched card programs a mechanical loom, or how early digital computers stored instructions. The sequence of operations is encoded in a physical medium before the machine runs, and the machine reads and executes that sequence autonomously. Hero also described, in his treatise on automata, two different types of automated theatrical device. One was a mobile, self-moving miniature stage that would roll forward, stop, perform a scene using moving figures, perform another scene, and then exit, driven by falling weights and controlled by ropes with knots that triggered changes in the performance at preset moments. The other was a stationary device with a more elaborate display. Hero describes the narrative content of these performances in detail, including the sound of thunder produced by metal balls falling onto a hidden drum at a mechanically timed moment. These weren't toys in the dismissive sense, they were technically sophisticated engineered systems performing predefined sequences of operations, and the engineering principles Hero applied to them appear in his other practical devices, including temple door openers that worked using heat-driven air expansion to push water into a bucket, making the bucket descend and pull open the temple doors, all triggered automatically by a priest lighting a fire at the altar. Hero also designed what is generally considered the world's first coin-operated vending machine, a device that dispensed a measured amount of holy water when a coin was inserted, because the coin landed on a lever that opened a valve and then slid off, closing it again, cutting off the flow when the preset amount had been dispensed. He even described a primitive steam turbine called the Aeola Pyle, in which steam from a boiler was channeled through two nozzles mounted on a sphere, causing the sphere to rotate as the steam was ejected, a working demonstration of reaction propulsion that wouldn't be seriously developed for practical use for another 18 centuries. For our third case, we travel from the Mediterranean world to the Islamic Golden Age and to an engineer named Al-Jazari, who lived in what is now southeastern Turkey and worked at the court of the Archytas dynasty from roughly 1174 until his death in 1206. Al-Jazari was a polymath in a tradition that maintained and extended the Greek mechanical heritage while adding substantial original innovations, and in 1206 he completed a comprehensive illustrated manual called The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, which describes 50 different machines in remarkable detail, with careful diagrams, many of which have survived. Among the devices described in that book are 4 automata specifically designed to entertain and impress, and these represent some of the most sophisticated self-operating machines documented anywhere in the medieval world. The most famous is a programmable band of musicians mounted on a boat, designed to float on a lake during parties, with 4 mechanical figures that could be made to play different musical rhythms by repositioning a series of removable pegs on a rotating cylinder. The cylinder drove a series of levers connected to the figure's arms and hands, and each peg triggered a specific motion at a specific moment, producing a different drum pattern or musical sequence depending on where the pegs were placed. The key point here is the programmability. The music the figures played wasn't fixed. It could be changed before performance by rearranging the peg pattern, and the cylinder would then execute whatever sequence had been set. This is a genuine, working, pre-programmable mechanism with interchangeable instruction sets, described in a surviving illustrated manual with enough detail that working replicas have been built from Al-Jazari's own descriptions. He also described a hand-washing automaton, a mechanical figure shaped like a woman that held a pitcher of water and would automatically refill a basin after the user drained it, using a float mechanism to detect the water level and trigger the refill. Al-Jazari's machines are particularly valuable in the history of automata because the illustrated manual survived in multiple copies, giving historians much more reliable primary documentation than exists for the Greek automata, most of which are known only through textual descriptions, rather than engineering diagrams. Our fourth case comes from China, roughly contemporary with Archytas in Greece, and involves 2 separate figures from Chinese history, the philosopher Mozi and the carpenter-engineer Lu Ban, both active in the 5th century before the Common Era. Several classical Chinese texts describe wooden birds attributed to both of these figures, and in Lu Ban's case, the texts also mention a wooden horse or other mechanical animal that could move. Lu Ban is a real historical figure who became sufficiently important in Chinese tradition that he is honored today as the patron saint of builders and construction workers, and the descriptions of his mechanical devices appear in texts including the Hanfei Zi and are discussed in later Chinese scholarship. The wooden bird attributed to Luban is described as capable of flying, with some versions of the account specifying it flew for several days before landing, which historians generally treat as the kind of numerical exaggeration that accumulates around legendary figures across oral tradition. Mosey, the philosopher, is associated with similar accounts. Both Luban and Mosey were working in a tradition of what might be called practical engineering philosophy. The Mohist school in particular was deeply interested in mathematics, logic, and physical mechanics in ways that set it somewhat apart from other ancient Chinese intellectual traditions. The key honest caveat here is similar to the one for Archytas. No physical artifacts or engineering documents from these specific flying devices survive, and the textual evidence postdates the claimed events by enough time that the details have certainly been shaped by tradition. What can be said with confidence is that these accounts place mechanical flying automata in 5th century BCE China alongside genuine surviving evidence of sophisticated Chinese engineering from the same general period, and that the descriptions have enough technical specificity, hollow body, controlled release, propulsion by some released pressure, to suggest they describe real experiments with real mechanisms rather than pure mythology. It's worth noting that Archytas's pigeon and Luban's bird were described independently in civilizations with no documented contact during the same century, which doesn't prove either one worked as described, but does suggest that the underlying question of whether a machine could be made to fly was being pursued simultaneously in places very far apart. Our 5th case moves into the realm of confirmed physical evidence rather than ancient text alone, because the 5th case connects directly to one of the most extraordinary surviving objects from the ancient world, the Antikythera mechanism. We've discussed this device in earlier videos on this channel, but its relevance here is specific and worth addressing directly. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901, and now understood through modern CT scanning to contain 37 precision bronze gears, is the world's oldest confirmed analog computer. But what makes it relevant to the history of automata specifically is what it proves about the mechanical tradition it belonged to. The ancient writer Cicero, in the 1st century before the Common Era, described seeing mechanical devices built by Archimedes that modeled the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, and could be operated by hand to show their positions for any date. He described these as working mechanical models, not illustrations or drawings, actual mechanisms that moved. The Antikythera mechanism appears to be a surviving example of this tradition, demonstrating that the level of precision, gear cutting, and mechanical modeling Cicero described was genuinely achievable, and that the Greek world possessed both the mathematical knowledge and the craft skills to build machines of this sophistication. This matters for the broader history of ancient automata, because it provides hard physical evidence that the engineering complexity required to produce programmable or mechanically sophisticated devices was genuinely present in the ancient Mediterranean world at the same time the automata described by Hero and others were being built. Hero himself is generally dated to the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era and worked in Alexandria, a city with a deep tradition of mechanical engineering that almost certainly passed through the same Rhodian tradition that likely produced the Antikythera mechanism. The mechanism is therefore not just a marvel in itself, it's physical proof that the world Hero and others were working and actually possessed the mechanical capability their written descriptions require. For our 6th case, we return to mythology, but with an important distinction. Talos, the giant bronze man of Greek mythology who guarded the island of Crete by walking its perimeter 3 times daily and hurling boulders at approaching ships, appears in the 3rd century BCE epic poem Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes, where he is described as the last of the Bronze Age men, a creation of the smith god Hephaestus, given to King Minos as a guardian. In the story, he is eventually killed when Medea tricks him into scraping his ankle against a rock, exposing the single vein of divine fluid running through his body, called ichor, which drains out and causes him to collapse and die. Talos is mythology, not a real device. He did not actually exist. But the reason Talos belongs in a video about ancient automata is precisely the question his existence raises. Why did ancient Greeks, in the 3rd century BCE, develop the specific concept of a large mechanical bronze figure that performed a repeated protective task autonomously without human control? The answer researchers studying the history of automata have proposed is that Talos is a mythological extension of real contemporary thinking about what self-operating machines could do. The same tradition that produced Archytas's pigeon, Hero's programmable cart, and the Antikythera mechanism was simultaneously populating its mythology with giant mechanical guardians, mechanical servants built by gods, and bronze animals that moved on their own. The philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, explicitly engaged with the idea of automated tools in his Politics, speculating that if tools could operate by themselves, there would be less need for human labor, and potentially the conditions for slavery could be eliminated. Aristotle wasn't describing science fiction. He was using the concept of self-operating machines, which clearly existed in some form around him, to make a philosophical point about labor and human dignity. Talos is the mythological extreme of that same line of thinking, scaled up to the size of a guardian deity rather than a demonstration device, powered by divine fluid rather than steam or falling weights, but expressing the same underlying human fascination with the idea of a machine that acts on its own will to accomplish a defined purpose. So what does this history actually add up to when you look at all 6 cases together honestly? Several genuinely different civilizations, Greek, Islamic, Chinese, working in periods ranging from the 5th century before the Common Era through the 13th century of it, and across a geographic spread from southern Italy to central China, all independently developed the concept of self-operating machines, and in several documented cases built real, working examples. The mechanisms they used drew on the physical principles available to them: steam pressure, compressed air, hydraulics, gravity-driven falling weights, mechanical linkages, and carefully wound ropes. And the applications they chose for these mechanisms reveal something consistent and interesting about human priorities across cultures and centuries. Entertainment ranked extremely high. Hero's self-moving theatrical devices and Al-Jazari's programmable musicians were designed to impress and delight audiences. Religious impression was nearly as important. Hero's automatically opening temple doors were designed to make worshippers experience the doors opening as a divine response to the lighting of a sacred fire. Practical utility was there too. Hero's vending machine was functional engineering. Al-Jazari's hand-washing device was a practical convenience. An intellectual demonstration was present from the beginning. Archytas' pigeon was by several ancient accounts a demonstration of mechanical principles, rather than a practical tool. What these cases collectively disprove is the lazy assumption that genuine mechanical sophistication began with the Industrial Revolution, or that ancient engineers were working only with the simplest tools and ideas. The programmability Al-Jazari built into his musician figures, encoding different rhythmic sequences into a repositionable peg cylinder, uses the same underlying logic as a mechanical loom punch card or an early digital computer memory, not because ancient engineers understood computing, but because the problem of encoding a sequence of instructions into a physical medium so a machine can read and execute them has a limited number of physically achievable solutions, and Al-Jazari found one of them in 1206. Hero's rope-wound cart uses the same fundamental logic for the same reason. These are not coincidences or ancient prescience. They're evidence that intelligent people working seriously on engineering problems across different eras and cultures kept discovering the same underlying principles, because those principles reflect actual physical reality rather than any particular cultural tradition. The real story that doesn't get told often enough isn't that ancient people secretly had technology we only rediscovered recently. That's an exaggeration the evidence doesn't support. The real story is more interesting and more honest than that. Ancient engineers were genuinely ingenious, working with genuine sophistication within the constraints of what their materials and physical knowledge made possible, and the tradition of building self-operating machines that perform predefined sequences of actions is genuinely continuous from Archytas in the 4th century BCE through Hero in the 1st century, CE through Al-Jazari in the 13th century, through the mechanical clocks and automated looms of early modern Europe, through the programmable machines of the industrial era, through the digital computers and autonomous robots of today. That continuity is real. The gaps in it are real too. Knowledge was lost, traditions were interrupted, devices were never built from promising descriptions. But the impulse to build machines that act on their own instructions, to encode a task into a device and let the device execute it without being steered in real time, turns out to be one of the most persistent engineering ideas in recorded human history. And it was already well underway before any civilization now thought of as modern had even begun. If this kind of real, deep, properly sourced history of ideas was worth your time today, the best thing you can do right now is hit that subscribe button, because there is a lot more of this kind of digging still to come. If you found this interesting, share it with someone who thinks robotics began in the 20th century, because Hero of Alexandria's programmable cart would like a word with that assumption. And if you are still here at the end, do me one favor and like this video right now. It takes 2 seconds and it tells me you want more of exactly this, the real story, every single time.